Hey guys, this is Reese, and in this video, I wanted to talk about how you can systematize your automated rules between Google and Facebook ads. And so I thought this was really important because ideally, your automated rules will help either notify you or execute growth opportunities for you, as well as de-emphasizing or pausing stuff that's just not yielding a return that's worth it. And so I found that it can be kind of difficult to think of all the little things that could counterbalance each other in an account. And so I created this system to really just help me generate all the rules that I would need automatically based on the goals and data I had for a given account. And so in this case, what I do is I start off by setting my ROAS target. And so this stands for return on ad spend. In Facebook, they spell it out like this. There's a website purchases ROAS metric that you can track in there. And in Google, this is usually referred to as conversion value over cost. And so really what this is it's your revenue divided by your ad spend. So one thing to keep in mind here is that this does not factor in your gross margins or other expenses, anything like that. It's not profit or even net profit divided by ad spend, just revenue. So when setting your ROAS target, you want to make sure that you're factoring for those other things. For example, if your margins are 50%, you might be just breaking even on a ROAS of 2. So you probably wouldn't want to, you definitely wouldn't want to set a 1. That doesn't necessarily mean you're breaking even if you've got hard costs to account for. So keep that in mind when setting your ROAS target if you're not already sure what it should be. So in this case, let's just say we're saying our target ROAS is 2, and then from here, we'll enter in historical data we have, in this case, from our Facebook account. So you can use Google data here as well. If so, you won't get data about your unique checkout conversion rate or add to cart conversion rate and targets for checkouts and add to carts. The reason why those are helpful is because these can serve as leading indicators in a Facebook account when there might either be some conversion delay in people's natural buying cycle or also just to give us an indicator ahead of the purchase itself. So Google doesn't provide checkout and add to cart metrics as easily as Facebook does. So if you don't have those, don't worry about it. You can still use something like this. In this case, it wouldn't affect your Google rules either. The Google rules are based strictly off of your ROAS target and your average order value. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like, my first rules here, these are the ones that I consider the most essential. If something spends my average order value and doesn't have any purchases, then I want to pause this keyword. And for most accounts, I usually look at this for the last 30 days on a daily basis. And also, if something has gotten a purchase, but it's still meeting less than half my ROAS target after giving it 2 average order values worth of chances, then I pause that also. And then for ad groups, I usually add a little more leeway, just in the event that I wouldn't want one keyword to ruin an entire ad group for me if I have other keywords in there, whether they be different match types or anything else like that. So in this case, I'll pause an ad group if it spends 2x my average order value and has no purchases. So I mentioned growth opportunities earlier too, and so if I do happen to have a campaign that's exceeding my ROAS goals and it's limited by budget, then I definitely want to know about that because in this case, if my ROAS target means that I'm profitable, if I'm missing an opportunity to generate more profit, then most likely I want to be able to jump on that. So in this case, I also have this rule run daily to let me know about those opportunities. And really the reason why all of these rules, and you'll see the rest are too, are scheduled daily is just because I want to make sure that if anything hits these criteria, I already know what my goals are and I know the kinds of decisions I would make in the account on a given basis. I want to make sure that these things are being executed as soon as they're applicable. And so in this case, daily is about as frequent as we can set an automated rule to run in Google, but I do think that it makes sense for Google to not let us run them any sooner also because uh, Google's conversion data isn't in real time. It can take 8 hours or more in some cases. So this just helps us make sure that we're not firing any rules prematurely. And you can see here too, if we adjust our ROAS target, like let's just say that our ROAS target's 4, then you'll see the customer acquisition target down here gets cut in half, as do our checkout and add to cart targets. And then our automated rules, this one is the only one that has a ROAS target in here. Actually, this one does too. So when we adjust that, we'll only get emails if our ROAS is greater than 4, and if our keywords that have purchases have a ROAS less than 2. So now the threshold here is upped a little bit. So I'm going to set this back to 2. And then looking at these are what I call my secondary rules. These I think I would almost always want regardless of the circumstances, unless for whatever reason ROAS or a specific return wasn't a priority. Most of the time it is. Here, these keywords are pretty much all centered around bid adjustments. And so one thing to note here is that these aren't going to really be applicable if you're using smart bidding strategies like maximize conversions or target CPA, target ROAS. These won't really have any effect on those, but if you do happen to be using any manual or enhanced cost per click bidding strategies, basically these help you fill in the gaps and kind of, I would say, give you like the step in between pure manual bidding without adjustments, which in my opinion is not usually optimal. You usually want to make sure that your bids are responding to the kind of data that you're bringing in and that it's being acted on pretty quickly. Because smart bidding is able to handle all that in real time, that's part of why this doesn't even apply. But if you are using manual bidding and kind of want to take a step toward automation, that's what these rules can help you with. So in this case, if we see that we've spent more than half of our average order value and still haven't gotten a purchase, then this rule, as a sort of preliminary measure, is going to decrease your bids by about 25%. And one thing I'll mention too is that these also run on a daily basis. And the reason why some people might think like, okay, well, we want to make sure we have a week's worth of data, etc. And sure, like I think that's fine, but I also think too, in most of the time, especially in e-commerce, I prefer to use dollars instead of time as kind of like my measure of what I'm willing to tolerate. Mostly just because, especially if you're just starting out, cash flow is going to be a much more important metric for you than some kind of like algorithmic significance. So important to keep in mind too, minimum bids and maximum bid limits across all these, just to make sure that you don't have a keyword, especially on the increase side. So you don't have a keyword that's being lifted into the stratosphere and one day it has like a $200 bid. We wouldn't want that. So in this case, 25% for decreasing the bid, and I think that's a pretty good measure to where we're not basically just getting rid of the keyword altogether, but also making sure that our adjustment actually has some significance behind it. Because especially if you're selling apparel or something like that, the bids can be pretty cheap. And so if you're adjusting a 50-cent bid by less than 25%, it's really not even much of an adjustment at that point. And so in this case, spending when we're half past our average order value, have no purchases, it's just a preliminary adjustment to basically make sure we're not overbidding on that keyword before we get to that purchase mark. This basically just gives us a little extra leeway to get more clicks at a cheaper cost to see if that keyword really is worth it. We're just buying a little bit of runway with that bid adjustment. And pretty much the same thing here with this keyword bid adjustment right here. We're decreasing our bids by 25%, even if we have a purchase, but our ROAS target is less than 80% of what we want it to be. So in this case, if our goal is a 2, If our ROAS is less than 1.6, just 80% shy of where we want to be, will decrease by 25%. And the thinking there is that ideally, um, if we're getting more purchases at the same rate and we decrease how much we're paying per click by 25%, hopefully this gets to the point where we're about 5% or so above our ROAS target, or at least meeting it. Um, and of course, we want to make sure that we're increasing bids on keywords where we still have opportunity. So if our purchases are greater than zero, and if we're 25% ahead of our ROAS target, and we also have less than 80% of impression share, and this is top impression share, so this is less than 80% of impression share in the top 3 spots on the search results page, then we're going to go ahead and nudge our bid up by about 25% to see if we can maximize our revenue at our target ROAS. And then these last two down here, these I would say are more going to be up your alley if you want to make sure, like if you have a lot of keywords in your account and they're not spending much, unless it's for a reason like low search volume. In those cases, Google won't serve an ad for a keyword that's not generating a certain number of ad impressions per month. This won't do anything for those. But if you have keywords that can serve more and the bids are just too low, and you want an easy, systematic way of making sure that the bids are being increased on those, then you can use rules like these, where the impressions are less than 50 over the last 30 days. That's a pretty good indicator that's not showing very often. And your top impression share is less than 75%, then you can increase bids on that by about 25%. And it'll happen on a daily basis, so it might increase your bids by a good amount over time. That's why I do think it's good to set a max bid limit. And I would say that that max bid limit shouldn't be anything that's too far out of the norm for your account. If your average cost per click is around $1, then maybe you want this to be somewhere between $3 to $5 as a max. And then the last one, increasing bids by 5% if your impressions are greater than 50, but top impression share is less than 80%, and spend is still less than half of your average order value. So in this case, this is just another way of making sure that keywords that aren't serving very often don't remain unknown in your account. And one thing I'll mention about these two is that, one, to make sure that these don't spend recklessly, we do have max bid limits in place, but we also have our pause rules. And so the idea is that eventually these kinds of unknown keywords will eventually wind up in a bucket where they're either working well and we increase bids on them, like with any of these adjustments up here, or actually just this one, we increase bids on it until our impression share is about as high as it can be, or we just end up pausing it because it doesn't perform. And so this way, we don't have any keywords in the account where we just don't really have a handle on what the performance is. Instead, we're just servicing them to either be fully maximized and we're getting all the revenue we can from that keyword, or we're pausing it because performance just doesn't make sense right now. And then the last couple of rules I have on the Google side, these are more strict. And I would say that if you're very diligent about adhering to a certain target ROAS, then typically these are going to be more up your alley. In this case, pause ad groups if purchases are greater than 0, ROAS is less than half your target, and you've spent more than 2.5x your average order value. And so in this case, this can affect a lot of spend, but I also think that it's giving some fairly generous leeway here. If you've given something 2.5 times the amount of chances that you can make money back on, and you're still at less than half of your target ROAS, it's very likely that this is either unprofitable or unsustainable for you. But given those number of chances, it's unlikely that it's going to change anytime soon. That being said, the reason why I put it in this stricter category is because in some cases, in some accounts I've analyzed, this can affect a fairly significant amount of spend. And so in those cases, I do recommend that you use the filters in the interface first. Filter for purchases greater than 0, less than half your ROAS target, and spend greater than 2.5x your average order value on the ad groups tab, just to know what you're getting into before you automate that. And I think that that should be pretty much the rule for anything is know what's going to be affected and know exactly what will be executed before you automate it. So keep that in mind. It can affect a lot of spend, but the idea here is that we're creating these rules to make sure that we're achieving some sort of sustainable profitability or return on ad spend, and to make sure that we're not having to go back into the account or especially to like wake up in the middle of the night to make sure that a keyword hasn't spent more than it should. And then this last one right here, pause ad group if the impressions are less than 50. And so in this case, again, I'm using data from last 30 days. This one I only run on a monthly basis, but the idea here is that we're only running this rule. Well, the idea here is that, let's just say that you are using smart bidding and that the bid adjustment rules don't really apply to you as much. So in this case, if we're running target CPA and we have a campaign with several ad groups in there, there are likely some where the keywords are too specific, or at least much more specific compared to others in the campaign, that those ad groups just aren't generating a very significant amount of impressions. So the goal of this rule is to basically help your campaigns get a little bit leaner. That way your algorithm for smart bidding has fewer data points that it's trying to stretch across and optimize. In most cases, if you're serving fewer than 50 impressions a month, not even really 2 impressions a day, then it's very likely that that ad group isn't being a very big contributor in that overall campaign. So as long as it's not generating a significant amount of revenue for you, which I doubt it is, but you could add a second qualifier here if you wanted to, then we're just going to pause that out so that the algorithm has fewer data points to stretch across. The idea is that it'll act a little more effectively if it's only concentrating on the top 10, 20% of ad groups and keywords that are generating the bulk of your conversions for you. So those are all the rules that we have here for Google. And then looking at Facebook, it's a much shorter list, but there's also some more criteria here because, as we mentioned at the beginning of the video, we also have our unique checkout rules baked into this system. And so we talked about this in the video on Facebook automated rules, but the scheduling here does work differently. As opposed to daily, I tend to run these rules continuously, which for Facebook is about every 30 minutes. And in most cases, I find that their conversion tracking tends to sync back to the platform a little more quickly. That being said, if you find out that you have significant conversion delay, you'll probably want to figure out a target to bake that into your system, or use maybe a slightly more lenient schedule than continuously, or even bake it into your numbers right here. So that's a topic for a different video, but just to give you a quick example, conversion delay does tend to be likelier involving purchases that are more expensive or involve more research. A lot of times those two go hand in hand, but if you're selling like a $15 thing, like it's a $15 coffee or something like that, like a bag of coffee, then there's probably not a huge amount of research that needs to go into that. That being said, I'm now realizing I take my own coffee pretty seriously, so that might be an exception. But typically, if it's a more cheaper, commoditized good, your conversion delay probably won't be very high because the research to buying cycle is pretty short. But if you're selling something like a $1,000 plus luxury handbag, then the research cycle, especially if it's an expensive product for your customer, is likely to be pretty lengthy. So in that case, I'd recommend looking up some things on conversion delay, and we'll probably do a video on that soon before setting up continuous rules for Facebook. All right, so in this case, this one's pretty similar to our pausing keywords rule for Google. So in this case, we'll pause an ad if it spends more than $32, has no purchases, and in this case, if it's also greater than our unique checkout target. So if we come back here, we can see that our cost per unique checkout target is about $6.50. So this is rounding up a bit, just based on how the formula is set up. So keep that in mind. It's literally just taking our checkout target from here. And in this case, most of these rules are using a checkout target as opposed to add to cart. The reason why I chose to set it up that way is just because I see the checkout as just a bit further down the funnel and a bit closer to purchase than add to cart. And in this case, pause ads if our spend is greater than average order value, checkouts are less than 1, and purchases less than 1. And so this is really just kind of a second assurance on top of this rule, because I was finding that in some cases, if I'd had an ad that either generated really nothing, if I had no checkouts, but my spend was still getting high, because I had this criteria in there, the rule wouldn't run. So then I had to create something else that accounted for not having any checkouts to make sure that it would work out. So in this case, basically 2 rules to pause an ad if you don't have any purchases. One that does so if you're getting checkouts but they're too expensive, and one that does so if you have no purchases or checkouts whatsoever. And then this one, a little more cautious, but if you have purchases and then a return on ad spend that's half your goal and you've spent 2x your average order value, this also gets paused. And again, in this case, you might be wondering, especially because Facebook's learning phase tends to be something that I hear about a lot, and you might be wondering if you're pausing ads like this, will it affect your learning phase and things like that? Yeah, to a degree. I mean, it's hard to almost do anything in a Facebook ad account without Facebook saying in some way that the learning phase is going to be effective. But I also don't think that if your ads aren't performing, then we really shouldn't be worried about the learning phase. We should be worried about establishing performance first. And I don't even like that I'm advocating worry, but the idea is that performance is your revenue and your ability to generate a profitable return on that revenue are ultimately going to do much more for your business than whether something happens to be in learning or not. So that's typically the approach that I take. If your ads are getting purchases, so yeah, we covered this one, less than half your ROAS, more than 2x your average order value, it'll get paused. And these last two, these look at ad sets. So this one is if your spend is more than 2.5x your average order value, actually just 2x your average order value. Purchases are less than 1, and your unique checkouts are greater than your target cost. And so I'll probably create another rule similar to this one, where we actually also have, just in case your ad set has no checkouts whatsoever, that's accounted for also. And then the last, pausing an ad set if purchases are greater than 0, but your ROAS is less than half your target and you've spent more than 2.5x your average order value. And so really the idea here is like, sure, these might cause your learning phase to be activated, but the idea here is that we really want to be either testing more effective creative or testing more relevant audiences, or ideally both, if that's what the rules are kind of telling us. One thing that I do like about having these rules in place, I typically use mostly the ad set rules, because in many of the accounts I work with, I'm running dynamic creative, so pausing ads wouldn't necessarily do anything for you differently than pausing an ad set if you're using dynamic creative, since it's all treated as one ad unit in Facebook's interface. So in that case, I use mostly the ad set rules, and it still encourages me to focus on better creative because I know that that's such a big part of Facebook's equation. And so keep that in mind when you're testing these. As with any rule, the idea is to stop the bleed before it gets too bad. At least that's the case with many of these. We don't want to spend unprofitably unless we have some kind of goal that dictates otherwise for whatever reason. Um, but the idea here, spend profitably and really focus on things like creative and changing things, even if it's user experience on the site to make conversion rate better. We want to ask these bigger questions that are going to help our account perform better in the long run as opposed to trying to get the same thing to work over and over again. So I also have these automated rules. You can grab a copy for yourself. Right now, I'm selling these on Gumroad, so I have a link in the description that you can check out if you want to just grab this for yourself and use it and implement it. I highly encourage it. So wish you the best with this, and thanks so much for watching.